This video is not focused on a pleasant topic, but I think it's an important topic and I think it's worth addressing. So here it goes. So the other day I was talking to a friend of mine who, much like me, is a first-generation farmer. And he was telling this story about a farmer in his local area, which is not the same as my local area, who recently killed himself. It's a super sad story. It's a guy who is in his early 50s. He was married. He had a couple of children. I think the youngest two were still in high school. The older one was in college. And apparently his farm had been struggling financially. The financial debt that their farm had probably meant that they were gonna go under in the next couple of years. And one day when he was all alone in the house, he went out into the backyard and shot himself. And now a story like that is horrible, and I personally don't even feel comfortable talking about it in this video. But I am talking about it because I think it's an important thing to address, and for too long it's been a taboo topic that nobody really wants to go into. And because our society isn't comfortable with talking about it, I think more and more people are needlessly dying, and the farming community is facing an epidemic.
September is Suicide Awareness Month, and in today's video I want to make you aware of challenges that farmers face, and as well as some of the reasons behind them. Suicide rates among farmers are 6 times higher than the national average. It's a problem that has persisted for decades and has only been made worse by the challenges of the past few years. And while recent research suggests that the stigma around mental health in farm country is beginning to break down, it's still a very difficult topic to talk about.
Now, I know I'm not a professional on this one, and I'm not someone who's out here trying to give advice, but I feel like a lot of the issues related to farmer suicide are rooted in 3 very specific things. Number 1, the identity of a farmer is very much rooted in being a farmer. I mean, I see that myself every time I get up in the morning and do my regular chores. At this point in my life, I derive a significant portion of my personal identity in the fact that I'm a farmer. And heck, I wasn't born into this life. Moving out here and starting this farm was essentially a midlife crisis for me. I can't even imagine how much of an identity this is for somebody who's a 2nd generation, 3rd generation, 4th generation farmer. There's so much about this way of life and this community that really is part of your identity, that really is rooted so much in who you are based on what you're doing. And if something were to threaten that identity, I could see it being catastrophic. Hey, Kurt Cobain, I'm not trying to threaten you, buddy. You know, the other day I was actually talking to my buddy Chip McGregor, who is a beef farmer out in Indiana, and he said it very, very eloquently.
I am a farmer, I am this. They think that that can be removed once you step off of that farm.
That becomes a huge part of your identity. When there's risks or threats to that identity, that becomes the time I feel like you see a lot of folks get high anxiety and get to some dark places.
You know, Chip's got a really interesting background. He is a multi-generation farmer. His father was a farmer. His wife's parents were farmers. He's now a farmer. But also before he became a farmer, he was in the military. And as many folks know, over the last couple of decades, the US military has actually done a lot of work confronting the suicide problem that they have with both enlisted folks as well as recently retired folks.
Look at the picture of all of us non-commissioned officers that were standing together in 2008. Half of the men in that picture had either very badly hurt themselves, got hurt in war, or had killed themselves. What I learned is nobody was prepared for this, and there's one common theme that ran through veteran suicides, and that common theme was identity.
And so while Chip is now very focused on the farming community, his military background has really given him an interesting perspective on the suicide epidemic with farmers.
Shame is a terribly powerful thing. The loss of identity, that's the sticking point. They can't see a future that's worth living. And then they make a long-term fix to a very short-term problem.
And so yeah, like Chip said, a farmer has so much wrapped up in their identity with their farm. You know, a farmer derives identity from the land, a farmer derives identity from the work that they do, a farmer derives identity from maintaining traditions of their family. All of those things mean a whole heck of a lot. And when you look at some of the potential struggles that a farmer may have, whether they be financial or personal, that can be the kind of flashpoint that leads people down a very dark path. And so I bring all of this up in this video because I don't think we talk about it nearly enough as a society. I personally believe that these problems don't get better until we start normalizing talking about mental health and until we start normalizing talking about things like suicidal ideation. I know this is where it gets all very dark and uncomfortable, but I can't always make happy animal videos. Sometimes ugly truths need to be confronted. And now I also recognize for any suicidal farmers who might be out there, clicking on the link for this video to give it a watch is probably the last thing that they do. But arguably more importantly, what I want to try to do is reach the people who are in the lives of farmers who might be struggling, because it's with those folks that I think there's a real opportunity to get them very conscious of the issue and looking at their loved ones and recognizing and acknowledging when their loved ones might be having a problem and doing the things that could help them. That means doing things like having a conversation. And even if you don't have the right words, just being there for them.
If you have somebody that you're worried about, just don't leave them. They aren't going to want to talk to you. They aren't going to want to do anything. Just like anything else, when somebody's having a really hard time with something, just get in their space and sit there. You don't have to say anything.
Problems like this don't get better until we start talking about them. And I will keep saying that over and over again. Because this video right here is even my personal clumsy attempt to talk about them. Hey cows, let's go, fresh grass, come on. Hey cows, fresh grass, let's go, come on. Hey cows, come on, fresh grass. Hey cows, come on, fresh grass, let's go, come on. You know, when Chip and I were talking about this topic the other day, another issue that we both sort of touched on was this. It's that perspective and community are both important factors in these issues as well. You know, there's a term out there that carries a whole heck of a lot of baggage, but I'm not reluctant to use it, in that the concept of toxic masculinity, it contributes to the suicide problems that farmers face.
Toxic masculinity is extremely dangerous. I'm going to stop using that term because it puts people off, and I'm going to call it peacocking. When men are peacocking, that is extremely detrimental to one's own mental health. Now it creates a false identity that you have to keep up.
You know, I see it all the time in our local farming community where people with the fanciest tractors or the nicest farms get a little bit of clout. And a farmer who may be less successful will benchmark and compare themselves to a farmer who's more successful. And even if you're not talking about in your local community, all somebody has to do is thumb through Instagram and see beautiful farm photo after beautiful farm photo and stop and ask themselves, why does my farm look like such a piece of shit? I mean, that combination of comparing yourself to others, as well as the perception that men can't be vulnerable and talk about their feelings and when they're feeling down and when they're feeling sad, like those two factors working together are extremely brutal and can do some awful things to people's mindsets. And they can definitely lead to a person who is not comfortable with the idea of talking about their feelings or their personal failures. And I will personally say, if there's one thing that having this YouTube channel has taught me, it's that talking about your feelings and talking about your failures is an extremely, extremely powerful thing. Number one, for you, the sharer, it helps you really get something off your chest, and it leaves you feeling just so relieved after you've shared that. But then number two, for the listener, it actually creates a connection with the person who shared, and it means that that listener is going to be much more likely to share their negative thoughts and their failures and their feelings and open themselves and unburden themselves. In doing something like that, you create some amazing connections and personal bonds. Because heck, we all struggle. We all have our personal failures. We all collectively suck. And when you get into that space of negative thinking and negative thoughts, to be able to stop and have perspective to say, hey, others have felt like that too, as well as to say, and am I really thinking about doing this very permanent act because I don't like the way I'm feeling, or because I truly don't want to go on living? And that right there is an incredibly important distinction to make. And as Chip and I were chatting the other day, we both acknowledged that we're dudes in our 40s. And when you look back on your life as a guy in your 40s, you can see things that seem like the biggest disaster in the entire world. Like, good golly, when I think about how much of an embarrassment I was in high school, when you look at those massive and horrible things 25 years later, they seem almost silly and insignificant.
How you identify yourself right now at 23 will have absolutely nothing to do with how you identify yourself at 40.
And so to maintain that sense of perspective and realize that the way you're feeling now might not be the way you feel a week from now, 6 months from now, 6 years from now, is super, super important. And if you do something that drastic that cannot be undone, you're never gonna ever have that opportunity for that perspective. You know, I think the other thing that a farmer has against them when they're struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts is that there is something incredibly therapeutic when it comes to being on a farm. I mean, look at all of the trauma and PTSD programs that involve either doing farm work or working outside or working with animals or visiting animals. There's something just so incredibly primal about doing something like that.
There's something about the connection with animals that is very, very good for the human psyche. And it comes from, you know, thousands of years of agrarianism. And one of the best things you can do for your psyche is to go take a walk in nature.
I mean, heck, when I think about the period in my life when I was the most depressed, the absolute pit bottom, it was when I was in my early to mid 30s, and I was realizing I didn't like the city I was living in. I didn't have any friends around me. I didn't like the work that I was doing, and I felt like my life had no path or momentum forward. And I will say that personally, I was having some really dark thoughts back then. But it was actually going out to farms and visiting farms and helping farms, and then ultimately dreaming of having a farm of my very own. That is what pulled me out of my depression. Now, I can't imagine the struggle of a farmer who might be overloaded with debt and realizing that he's gonna have to sell the family farm and tarnish his family's legacy and be branded a loser in his community and not be able to work outside or work with his animals and do the things that he loves. That right there can be a very bleak headspace to be. But again, to give you some perspective, I turned to my friend Chip. You know, like I said earlier, Chip's father was a farmer, and back in the early 80s when a lot of farms were going under because they couldn't handle the debt that they took on in the 70s. Thanks, Earl Butts. You know, when that crisis was happening, in the early 80s, when Chip was just a kid, his family actually lost their family farm.
So somewhere in the mid 70s, we got into this large production style agriculture. The Secretary of Ag at the time, Earl Butts, said, hey, go fence row to fence row. A lot of small farmers like my parents, they went and they got into debt for not really good reasons. There was no real financial reason to do it. The loans came due in the early 80s, and my family was among the many, many families in the farm crisis that lost farms that had been in the family for generations. My dad was in really, really bad shape and was very close to suicidal for a really long period of time.
And now I'm sure for Chip's dad in the early 80s at that point, that was a very bleak and dark time. But if the guy's story ended there and he had killed himself, he wouldn't have gone on to do the things that he did.
You know, my dad rented land and rebuilt his operation in the way that he wanted. Well, where he was a bigger rancher the day he died than he was the day that he lost the farm. He passed on a number of traditions that I'm passing on to a 9-year-old boy right now. Just because you lost your farm, that doesn't mean that's the end of it. You live on through people, not through land.
You know, I think too often people who are farmers get too wrapped up in this idea that they are their farm, that their land is their identity, that the place that they're at is what makes them a farmer and makes them who they are. And if you had said a statement like that to me a couple of years ago, I probably would have agreed with you. But at this point, I've now come to realize that the farm is not about the place itself. It's about the experiences, it's about the things that you do, and it's about the things that you will do. And so who knows what happens? Maybe one day I end up losing this farm and I can't continue it the way it is and I gotta go do something else and move on. That won't necessarily mean I'm no longer a farmer. That doesn't diminish or erase the amazing memories that I have of this place and the experiences and skills that I've built up over the last several years. And while having the legacy of a farm to pass on to a future generation is actually nice, it's not necessary, and it's by no means the most important thing to pass along. The memories that you have, the legacy that you create, the lives that you touch, that's the stuff that really matters. And I think for me, why I think the idea of suicide is such a tragic thing is because it means so much of that potential and so much of that positive impact on the lives of others can get snuffed out, and it can have such a negative impact on the loved ones who might lose somebody to suicide. It's just absolutely heartbreaking to me. So if you're out there struggling, I implore you to go get some help. You know, nobody's embarrassed when they break their arm and they got to see the doctor and put a cast on. But there's such a stigma when it comes to getting help with what's going on up here. And that to me is a crying shame. So if you or your loved ones are struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts or other mental health challenges, I'm gonna leave some links down below. You can access them. Before you do something that you can't undo, by all means, please take advantage of these resources or even just reach out to a friend. It's gonna make such a difference in your life as well as the lives of others. Thanks for watching, everybody.